We're here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's November 8th here in Seoul. I'm Shin, and you're watching News Generation. Joining me in the studio is Cheska Dainhong.
Happy Wednesday, everyone.
Happy Wednesday, and Chiji.
Good morning.
Now, both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. As usual, let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. Now, temperatures have suddenly dropped here in the capital. Morning temperatures on Tuesday hovered around 1 to 12 degrees Celsius, which was much lower than the day before when they ranged from 6.5 to 13.5 degrees. This November has relatively been warm compared to previous years. Following Tuesday's sudden drop in temperatures, though, people have taken out their thick sweaters and padded coats, hinting that it's the start of winter. And speaking of winter, a must-eat Korean street food during this time of the year is 붕어빵. It's a fish-shaped pastry filled with sweet red bean paste, and won 붕어빵 used to cost around 77 cents. But now, with rising food and energy prices, we've seen prices nearly double. To explain in more depth, we've seen domestic prices for the red beans used for this snack soar by 33% compared to last year. And Chinese President Xi Jinping recently reiterated what a woman should be doing for society. His exact words were, "Women have a critical role and must establish a new trend of family amid the country's aging population and record decline in birth rate." The Chinese president stressed that a woman must also prioritize family harmony and national development, which could be fostered through a new outlook on marriage and childbearing. Now, China did see its first population drop in 6 decades in January. Over the last 2 years, officials have been implementing various measures to bring the birth rate up. And that includes giving out financial incentives and boosting childcare facilities. But some are analyzing that Xi Jinping made somewhat of an insensitive or backwarded comment regarding what a Chinese woman should do, as the country is failing to see demographic-related stats bounce back as quickly as hoped for. So here in the studio, Chi, what did you think about Xi Jinping's comments?
Well, President Xi's comments definitely reflect the country's concern for the current demographic challenges, and his emphasis on women's role in helping out with the balance of family harmony, as well as encouraging more children, birth of children, could be seen as an attempt to really encourage and raise awareness of this issue. However, some critics may argue that his comments are rather traditionalist and regressive in terms of gender roles, because it's putting an additional pressure on just women in promoting the harmony of family and prioritizing family issues over careers and aspirations. So his comments are really going in the other direction of the change that we would like to see today in society.
And I think our generation is more sensitive about what traditional gender roles are. Is there even a concept of traditional gender roles, given that anyone can be whatever they can be, regardless of who they are biologically born as? Now, what did you think about Xi's comments?
I do agree with some of the comments that Xi also made. I understand that Xi Jinping was probably trying to encourage and promote increase in birth rate, as in global there's a declining birth rate. However, it can be seen as a bit controversial, of course, because as we discussed in a previous episode for low fertility rate, family plan is a very personal and private matter. And just by adding a digit to the entire population does not solve problems. If anything, it can also add problems such as crime issues, environmental issues, and many that kind of extrapolate beyond just those. I mean, even speaking from a psychological standpoint, a lot of the juvenile and even legal age crimes that are committed result from deeply rooted family issues.
Right.
So, just purely enforcing families to have more children or encouraging families to have children when they're not ready could potentially have effect on unforeseen problems.
Exactly, and I completely agree. Though it's a personal issue, I do understand at the same time how the public is trying to be involved with it, because it's demographics we're talking about, and it does affect society as a whole. And that was our news feed for this Wednesday, and let's now switch gears into our main discussion topic of the day, my AI voice secretary, with more.
Roughly a month has passed since Palestinian militant group Hamas launched a brutal attack against Israel, killing more than 1,000 and taking hundreds hostage. Since then, Israel declared war on Hamas, pledging to eliminate the Islamist militant group. But Israel's attacks on targets in Gaza have led to thousands of civilian deaths. According to Gaza's health ministry, over 10,000 Palestinians have since been killed in Gaza. This includes over 4,000 children. With innocent civilians suffering, some are pointing to neighboring countries to step up and accept them as refugees.
Since the war broke out between Israel and Hamas, more than 1.4 million people have been displaced inside Gaza. But it's not the first time we've seen violence erupt in this area. So Chihi, why don't you tell us about how the UN is viewing this refugee crisis, which has spurred from the war at the moment?
Well, first of all, according to an Israeli newspaper, which was reported on the 23rd of October, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has resulted in the displacement of 1.4 million refugees in Gaza and 200,000 people in Israel. And however, the current estimate suggests that the number of refugees can, of course, get even higher than that. And about half of them have sought refuge in the homes of their relatives in other regions, and others are staying in UNHCR schools as well. And the ongoing crisis in the Gaza Strip has been described by the UN's independent human rights expert as a quote-unquote political and humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. And also the UN Secretary General has also made two strong humanitarian appeals, stating that the Middle East is on the verge of the abyss. And he's called upon Hamas to immediately release all its hostages without any condition, and for Israel to grant rapid and unimpeded access to humanitarian aid as well for the civilians in the Gaza region.
And though it's been a long time since we've seen this refugee crisis, it's happening as we're speaking, right? Would you like to add on?
Absolutely. The Palestinian refugee issue is actually a very long-standing crisis, as we know historically, that has endured since the tumultuous events of the first Middle East conflict back in 1948. Now, according to the United Nations, the number has swelled to a total of staggering 6 million, and they are spread across Middle Eastern countries such as Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Now, the anguish of the situation is even more heightened as some refuse to actually leave the country and would rather risk their lives living in the area. Now, even those that have left to seek asylum face profound uncertainty as they can't secure any proper jobs or property in the new host country.
Exactly. And refugees from the Israel-Hamas war are just the tip of an iceberg. Recently, over in Spain, the Interior Ministry saw that the Canary Islands saw a record number of migrants. At least 32,029 people landed on the islands from January to November 5th, most coming from Senegal. So what's the global refugee count as we're speaking, and what caused them to flee their home country, Cheska?
Sure. As you mentioned, this is an ongoing and very serious world crisis that needs attention and global support. Now, if we take a look at the screen, we've prepared some stats to illustrate the current situation. Now, as of last year, there were 184 million refugees worldwide, marking the highest increase in refugee numbers since the tracking actually began. Now, if we count that, that is approximately about one refugee for every 74 people in the global population. Now, what makes the situation more alarming and critical is that almost half of those are children who are most vulnerable and desperately require protection. And it is very possible that the numbers can actually be much higher because in situations like this, it is extremely difficult to follow up in hostile war zones and refugee camps. And as we saw in the stats, refugees include women, children, and elderly that require urgent need for very comprehensive solution for vulnerable individuals who are exposed to danger every single day.
Right, so I completely agree. We're seeing the latest batch of refugees from the Israel-Hamas war, also the Ukrainian war, and the refugee crisis isn't just limited to one region. We're seeing it globally happening everywhere. Right. But a big issue is that neighboring countries don't seem to be as welcoming or open to the concept of letting these refugees in, right? So tell us more about that.
Right, so the refugee issue is a pressing and controversial issue, especially in Europe right now. The number of refugees arriving in the region has in fact increased by 83% compared to the year before. And those who are against accepting refugees in their countries often argue for three different arguments. First of all, it being security risks, and secondly, economic burdens. Thirdly, the challenges in cultural and social integration. And last but not least, limited resources. Now, the European Union has implemented a mandatory quota system for asylum seekers based on their population as well as their GDP size, along with substantial funding for those who get rejected. And this is all, of course, in the effort to reduce or address the refugee crisis. However, due to the recent wave of terrorist attacks by the extremists and growing concerns over illegal immigration, there's now a push to close borders within some of these countries as well.
Which is quite devastating if you think about it, because that could be an overgeneralization too. I do understand the three reasons why countries might be against it, as you mentioned, security, economy, and integration.
Right.
But at the same time, I do think that sometimes we look at one terror attack and then associate it to all the refugees out there, when sometimes there's no causality. But to better find out about the pressing refugee crisis around the world, let's now include an expert in our talks. So we started today's discussion by talking about the Israel-Hamas war and the refugee crisis. That's why we're now going to include a senior advocate for the Middle East from Refugees International. It's Jesse Marks. Welcome, Jesse.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Jesse, I'd like to ask you the first question. What's the biggest problem refugees around the world are going through at the moment?
I mean, first and foremost, I think it's important to look at the scale of displacement, both refugees, but also those who are internally displaced in their country. Currently, over the last decade, the number has skyrocketed. It's almost 100 million people globally who are now displaced. And the drivers of displacement are deeply connected, ranging from war, as you all discussed, but also more emerging challenges like climate change. Unfortunately, war and conflicts continue to fuel displacement, as we're seeing in Gaza. A surge in new or a resumption of previous crises are pushing millions into deeper uncertainty. Many of these are widely reported, like Gaza, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Syria. But many of these are largely absent from international media attention, right? There are skyrocketing levels of displacement as a result of violence and state fragility across Africa. For example, in the Congo or Ethiopia or across the Sahel. One of the challenges we're seeing now is record levels of displacement are also accompanied by more intensive violence against civilians and displaced populations. Look at Sudan. In West Darfur, for example, we're seeing troubling reports of ethnically driven violence from folks who are fleeing the region, which several decades ago faced one of the worst genocides in a generation. And this violence touches the entirety of the family, but it has distinct impacts on women, children, and protected minority groups who have specific, unique protection concerns in many of these areas.
You know, in situations like these, I think refugee hosting countries are extremely vital for the survival of refugees that seek asylum. However, I'm sure the countries also have their own struggles internally and both externally. Could you elaborate on those, please?
Certainly. I mean, the concept of durable solutions, which the UN identifies as the lasting solutions for displaced communities, have largely stalled. There are two primary types of receiving countries. First, those who refugees initially flee to at the instance of displacement. So in Syria, those would be neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey. In the case of Gaza, that would be Egypt. And then you have resettlement countries, which are the destination countries that many refugees themselves are seeking. That could be Europe, the US, and Canada. Most countries who initially receive refugees are themselves often facing severe economic, development, and humanitarian challenges, and in most cases lack the funding. Many of these refugee responses to support these countries are ill-equipped and underfunded, and the UN often has to do more with less. As a result, many refugees in refugee-hosting countries often choose to make more dangerous journeys from these countries toward more desirable places like Europe. And we see this with refugees currently fleeing Syria to neighboring countries for Europe, as well as increased numbers of refugees fleeing conflicts in Africa for Europe, as you mentioned previously with the case in West Africa. Meanwhile, with resettlement countries, destination countries are increasingly closing their door. It's not for a lack of capacity. In fact, many of these countries have the ability, whether it's the US, EU, Canada, but it's often about political will. And increasingly over the last 5 years, we've seen the viable legal pathways for people to leave resettlement countries diminish drastically.
Well, as you said, it seems as though political will is really important, as well as the actual resources that a country has to accept more refugees. It's a really complex matter, but why does our generation in particular, why should we keep an eye on this whole refugee crisis, do you think?
I think the short answer is we are the ones who are going to inherit these crises, right? The world is increasingly mobile and populations are moving. I mean, our generation is going to inherit the many conflicts that are happening now, but also the new drivers of displacement like climate change. And there's a large amount of debate happening within the UN about how we address and tackle those issues. One way, providing solutions to protracted displacement and refugees begins by, first and foremost, engaging with refugees themselves, right? Shifting resources into the hands of displaced communities and groups that are responding to their needs. This is a huge segment of the displaced population, our youth. Right? How do we invest in those youth to help meet the challenges in their communities, right? And I think the key thing really is our generation needs to be the drivers of change when it comes to shifting how we view refugees. The traditional perception is that refugees themselves are burdens, right? We have this mental image of people in a camp. But realistically, at the end of the day, refugees themselves are people just like us. They are economic assets. They are humans. They are communities that are futures. And at the end of the day, it is our generation which will assume leadership over these issues. And it's an opportunity for us to reshape that perception and help provide lasting solutions to their communities.
Definitely, Jesse. I can't agree with you more. I think we need to not only accept, but understand how we can better integrate these refugees into our lives, because that's the reality we're in. We're seeing so many displaced populations and communities. Learning how to use them for, whether that be for our own national benefit or better harmony, is key. And I hope our generation can lead that. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jesse.
And now I'd like to focus this part of our discussion into finding out how we can better accept and welcome refugees into our lives. And we first asked our viewers this question, so take a look at the screen to find out what 3 of them had to say. Let's start with Doina. Dona said, "The war in Europe changed everything all around the world. In Romania, there's lots of Ukrainian refugees. They received help from the government, a place to stay, food, and medicine." Arch said, "The Australian government treats boat arrivals as illegal maritime arrivals and currently denies them permanent protection visas. We only accept onshore and offshore, which are refugee status decided overseas programs." Tasmia said, "In the Bangladesh, we have the Rohingya refugees. They're facing overcrowded camps and increased insecurity. It's sad to see that they're the world's largest stateless population." Now, we can see that the refugee crisis is ongoing around the world. We kept mentioning that, but I think this part of the discussion now needs to focus on what countries that are receiving them need to be better aware of. So let's start with how Korea is like when it comes to accepting these refugees.
Right. Well, first of all, Korea was in fact the first country in Asia to actually enact a refugee law, and that was back in 2012. And also last year, the Korean government has contributed about $30 million to UNHCR, and the private sector has done more contribution. That was $50 million. What's unusually surprising is that private donations were a lot higher than the government contributions. And this could be a reflection that individuals are really willing to support these refugees. However, the actual refugee recognition rate is still very low. It stands at 2.6% in the country, which is less than 1/10 of that of the OECD countries as of now. And in fact, back in 2018, we had the whole controversy over accepting Yemeni refugees. Back then, the public was very cautious and very concerned about the social integration matter, as well as security matters. And in fact, the public opinion was very divided, and there wasn't a widespread acceptance or support for increasing the actual number of refugees that we admit.
Right, and I do think perspectives have changed since. If you remember last year, once the Taliban took over, a lot of refugees, around 400 were accepted to be allowed here in Korea. And then the public opinion, I remember, it was split. But compared to 2018, though, I do think we've seen some progress. And if you'd like to add on to what you think about South Korean society accepting these refugees.
As Jihi mentioned, I actually learned about this for the first time. I'm quite proud that we were the first Asian country to actually, at least participate in accepting refugees. However, I'm going to be a little honest here. As much as I'm of the opinion that we should lend our hands to, in the time of global crisis, as we have also received much support in times of need, I think the prevailing opinion in South Korea still has been on the more restrictive and sometimes, I'm sad to admit, antagonistic towards foreigners just in general. I understand the situations and the complicated matters as it is political and socio-economic, but I truly do hope that, as Jessie mentioned, that this is not just something that is happening to others. This is happening to all of us, and this is a problem that we will inherit, basically. So I do hope that in due time our society evolves and sort of embraces the important leadership in supporting the global crisis altogether.
Right, and I think for like all the topics that we cover on News Gen, our generation plays an integral part in solving this. And that's why my last question for you both is, how should our generation try to tackle this ongoing crisis then?
Well, I want to suggest two ways in which we, as the Millennials and Gen Z, can tackle this ongoing refugee issue. First of all, it would be advocacy and awareness. We could really make use of our digital and social media skills to really change the perception as well as raise awareness of this issue. As Jessie said, until now we've thought of refugees only as a burden, but if we think about it on a positive perspective, they are economic assets.
They are.
They are just people like us, and we have the responsibility to take care of them as well, because our generation will be inheriting this crisis, just like the climate change issue.
Exactly.
And secondly, volunteering and support would be one other way we can engage in. We can volunteer for organizations to help support them, and we can also make donations or engage in fundraising initiatives to actually provide direct support for those who are in need.
What about you, Cheska?
I agree with everything that she said, and I love the two-step sort of manual that we can follow. But to add on to that, all the things that Chihi mentioned and more, I think our generation has done and has shown proof that our generation has this incredible power that we have demonstrated over and over again, just to name, including the Turkey earthquake and many other social causes that our generation is sort of driving the force forward. So I think it is very, very important that we understand that now global struggles are completely borderless, and as we have repeatedly mentioned, this is a problem that we will have to inherit and deal with and solve, so that each and every one of us sort of take that leadership. And then I hope our generation can lead the way in starting a more open and respectful conversation to become true leaders of the new generation.
Of the new generation, which is powered by the fact that we're living in a borderless society. All issues are very interconnected. We're all global citizens here. And also remembering the fact that refugees aren't burdens. They could be assets and our neighbors. And we'll try to deliver that message to you more here on News Gen. Until then, we'll be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Cheska Dainhong.
Pleasure's always mine. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are News Generation.
You and I